So welcome everyone here in the room and out there in internet land. I'm very pleased to introduce today's ITS seminar speaker, Jeff Morales, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Not a calm, quiet job, I imagine. He comes to the High-Speed Rail Authority with an incredible wealth of professional experience, starting on the East Coast with involvement with President-elect Obama's transition team, focusing on transportation, Vice President Al Gore's National Performance Review, the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, and the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as U.S. Senate staff. He spent some time in Chicago as the past Executive Vice President of the Chicago Transit Authority, and most recently he's been mostly in California as the Senior Vice President of Parsons Brinckerhoff, one of the most important in the country, as well as for a time as the Director of the California Department of Transportation. Which probably seems a little calm in retrospect compared to what he faces now at the So it's just wonderful to have him here. This is, of course, one of the biggest projects California has ever considered doing. And I'm just really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Susan, and Dan Sperling as well. Thank you. Had a chance to work with ITS for a lot of years, going back to when I was at Caltrans, 2000 to 2004. And I think I made it into Dan's book at one point, which was a proud moment in my career. But I'm glad to be back, and I was going to say I was really excited by the turnout, but then I did hear it's compulsory for the students. So, but thanks anyway for coming. To your point, it's never a dull day when it comes to the high-speed rail program. There's lots going on and a lot of misperceptions about what's going on, but a lot of really good things happening, and they'll continue to keep happening as we go forward with the program. I want to introduce also Scott Jarvis is with me from the program. Scott is actually knows what he's doing when it comes to the program, so if you have any detailed questions, I'll probably turn them to Scott as we go ahead. What I want to do today is just give an overview of where we are with the program, what some of the obstacles are, what some of the accomplishments are, what the future looks like. But I think it's also really important to keep in mind why we are doing this and why this program matters in the first place. And recognize that when we talk about high-speed rail, it's not a project. It's not just a transportation project. It really is a much bigger investment in the state's future. That's what other countries are doing, what other parts of the U.S. want to do, and it's certainly the way we're approaching it as a program. One of my favorite statistics that I use all the time is that 1 out of every 8 Americans is a Californian. It's kind of mind-numbing when you think about that. And when we look at the size of the state, we're the 8th largest economy in the world. We need to make investments. What has made California that big, what attracted so many people, what allowed so many of us to live here, and what makes us so competitive have been previous investments. All sorts of things, whether it's in the water system, early on in the railroads, certainly at least bringing us out here. But then things close to home here, like the University of California system. Those are investments that the state makes in different kinds of infrastructure that have allowed the state to prosper. That's what high-speed rail really is. And one of the really important things, too, is for the first time, a major statewide investment is going to connect up the entire state, because we'll talk a little bit more about the Central Valley in particular. Central Valley is the fastest growing part of the state, but it has tended to be left out when the state has made major investments before. One of the things that high-speed rail will do is connect up not just Los Angeles and San Francisco, but the entire state altogether. when you talk about scale, we're embarking on a program to build what was built 150 years ago in the Northeast, the corridor system. Flip California over on the map, we actually run from Boston to South Carolina. It's always helpful to keep things in scale, but again, in terms of the scale of what we're doing, we're making a massive investment that really is generational and transformational. And so with that, we would be crazy if we thought it would be easy. Big investments, big types of things like this are never easy. Every major investment that's been made in the state has gone through this sort of controversy. The Golden Gate Bridge, may be the most iconic structure in the state, one of the most iconic structures in the country. Back in the 30s when it was built, way before we were in kind of lawsuit-hungry world we're in now, there were over 2,000 lawsuits filed against the Golden Gate Bridge being built. So, I think there's probably, I like to think of it as there's a direct relationship between the number of lawsuits and the value of what you're doing. So that's how I make myself feel better, at least anyway, when we look at our lawsuits. But every one of these, it's hard to imagine now, looking back 50 years, but when Governor Pat Brown proposed and put forward the plan for what really is now the modern University of California system, that got through the legislature by one vote. Imagine what California would be like had that not passed. The water system passed by one vote. Again, where would we be as a state without that? So, as we deal with the controversy, as we see the articles, as all those things come up, it's important to keep in perspective. This is nothing new. Doesn't make it easier, but at least helps put it in perspective. So given the controversy, it's like, why the heck are we doing this? Why would we? And that really gets back to the point of the importance of an investment like this. There are a few key factors. Population, I already said, 1 out of every 8 Americans. Another really amazing statistic is that even with projections that have been downgraded recently, our population is still growing. Within the next 20 years or so, we're supposed to add the population, the equivalent of Ohio, to California. And by 2060, the equivalent of New York to California. I always follow that up by saying, but not actual New Yorkers. So that's the good news. But imagine how can we possibly handle that sort of growth without major new investments in our infrastructure? Roads are clogged already. We have the traffic congestion, anywhere in the country. A lot of people don't realize that Los Angeles and San Francisco is the busiest short-haul air market in the country, busier than New York, Washington, or Boston, anything else. And about 1 out of every 6 flights leaving the LA area airports is going to the Bay Area. Volume of movement up and down our state. San Francisco Airport is one of the biggest proponents of high-speed rail. In fact, they call it their third runway. And the reason being, they're at capacity. And an airport would much rather use up runway space, gate space, on bigger planes flying longer distances. And from an energy perspective, it makes a lot more sense to do that rather than having 737s going back and forth with 100 people in them to have a 400 or 500 people going off in planes across the Pacific or across the country. Our air quality issues. There's been a consistent pattern in California over the last decade of the voters saying they want to see more sustainable development. They want to deal with air quality issues. The cap and trade program, which is really just getting underway, an example of that, of what this state is willing to do in order to be a leader. We're not going to be able to accomplish a lot of those goals without, again, doing some things very differently than we've done them in the past. And so what we're moving forward with is to develop a program that can help achieve those goals. And recognize, though, we've got to do it in a way that works in the modern world. in terms of the scrutiny we're under, the ever always important need to hold our costs down, be more efficient, to deliver benefits sooner, and very importantly, to recognize that this again is not just a transportation project. We will not succeed if all we do is build a rail line, because at the heart of high-speed rail for us in the state is really making sure it integrates with the other transportation systems in the state and helps foster sounder development in the cities, and particularly in the Central Valley as it grows. And so we're working with communities to look at how we really capture the value of that and grow more sustainably. Some of what will come out of it for the state. We're going to take cars off the road as we develop this. We're going to take planes out of the sky in a friendly way. Again, one out of all those flights out of LA heading to the Bay Area and back. That's actually where the biggest diversion of traffic will come from onto high-speed rail, will be out of planes and into trains. And that's what we've seen around the world, and even in this country. I mean, I think one of the things that skeptics will raise is, the U.S. people in the U.S. don't ride trains. We're not set up to do it. They think California's not set up, no one else is. Well, in California, one of our best-kept secrets is we have today 3 of the 5 busiest Amtrak corridors in the country. We have, and in the U.S., we have seen the result of investing in rail as far as diverting people from planes onto trains. Between Washington and New York, where Amtrak has upgraded the service to the Acela, which is the closest thing we have to high-speed rail in the U.S. They get about a 4-mile stretch, I think it is, in Rhode Island or something, where they can go about 160 miles an hour. But it's a faster service overall, more express, higher-end kind of service. Since that service has been introduced, traffic between Washington and New York has flipped. It went from being about 70% by air, 30% by rail, to being the opposite. And right now, I mean, if you've ever spent any time on the East Coast and have had to go back and forth, I don't know why anybody would fly between Washington and New York. That's what we've seen in other countries as well. Between Madrid and Seville, 80% used to go by air. Now it's 80% go by rail. Between Paris and Brussels, there now is no air service between the two. It's all by train. That's been the pattern all over the world we've seen, and that's something that we'll see happen here in California. And that has huge air quality benefits because we're seeing tremendous progress with automobiles, certainly in terms of their emissions, their fuel efficiency, everything else. Airplanes, we're not seeing that same sort of improvement. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and the trade-offs of taking an electric train versus another mode, a lot of those trade-offs are with planes. In many ways, our program is at its heart an environmental program. It's about air quality, it's about sustainability. There's been some attention, and you may have seen concerns about farmers and the impacts on agricultural land as we go through. Anytime you build anything, you're going to have some impact. This development here used to be open space. Now there are buildings on it. Something happened to that open space. It's not available for farming, for instance, now. But when you look at what's happened in California, in the Central Valley, which is the most the richest agricultural land in the country and arguably in the world, in the last decade, over 120,000 acres of prime farmland have been lost to development. And we will impact directly as we build less than 5,000 acres of our system. We're going to mitigate 1 for 1 for every one of those. But importantly, we'll help those cities through the valley develop in a more sustainable way. We'll see more developments like this here rather than sprawl. Fresno, which, anybody here from Fresno? Somebody just pretend you are. Come on. Anyway, yeah, all right. A lot of people don't realize how big Fresno is. The city of Fresno has 500,000 people, and the county has 1 million. It has, by itself, over the last, I think it's 20 years, consumed something like 51,000 acres of prime farmland by growing out. And so the mayor of Fresno, Ashley Swearingen, is a strong proponent of high-speed rail as a way of helping them change their development pattern and be able to focus development downtown, do infill development, and build up rather than out as a way of saving it. So we actually see high-speed rail as a way of protecting agriculture as we go forward. We're going to do some very creative things with habitat preservation. One of the interesting opportunities we have is we're building a very long system covering a lot of area. We can look at mitigating, instead of mitigating every little spot along the way, trying to come up with a bigger bang for the buck and preserving larger areas, more valuable natural environments as we go on. We'll do a lot of little things like just tree planting. We're going to start that in the next month or two as part of our mitigation program. And what I'll talk about, we have a commitment, and our plan is to be net zero emissions during construction, which I'm not sure has ever been done on any project, but for a project of this size is a major undertaking. We're doing that through a lot of different mechanisms. One of them is planting trees. We're going to be planting thousands and thousands of trees in the valley in particular as we start that construction. Huge positive impact on air quality. And then another very important element, which I'll talk about more, is this is an investment in a state rail program and in transit. And so as we develop our program, it will help develop and promote greater transit use, greater rail use overall throughout the state. And that's what we're moving forward with. We, over the course of the last year and a half or so, we really revised our approach to the program. For a long time, high-speed rail was being planned and designed almost in a vacuum, as just kind of a standalone system running from north to south. What we did over the last year or so was really reached out and connected with the regional transportation agencies, with regional planning agencies to look at how we can integrate the system. And what ended up happening last year, the legislature passed an appropriation for what really is an historic investment in state rail in California. $4.7 billion worth of state bond funds approved by the legislature last summer. That translates into investments all over the state of over $13 billion of improvements in rail. And what this slide shows is where we're going. We're working, a lot of people focus on the Central Valley. I've talked a lot about the Central Valley, but the fact is we're moving forward on a statewide basis today. In the San Francisco Peninsula, part of our program is to electrify the existing commuter rail system there, Caltrain, that runs between San Francisco and San Jose and then down to Gilroy. That's underway now. The environmental clearances to be able to start that electrification is in progress. That will actually be, in all likelihood, the first electric higher speed service in the state by 2019. It's a projection to have that up and running. That's underway now. In the Central Valley is where we're beginning the construction of the new dedicated system. And then in Southern California, as part of this program, we're working with the existing rail agencies to make targeted investments in their systems that improve things today for their commuters and ultimately get incorporated into the high-speed system down the road. And so these are the partners we're now working with. And it's as a result of this now, we are really investing literally from Sacramento to San Diego in improved transportation. And so things, as part of our program and our funding for it, things like the Central Subway in San Francisco are happening now as a project. Regional Connector project in Los Angeles, which is to connect up all the subways at Union Station, which will have a huge positive benefit for rail travel there. But every agency in the state is participating in this program now based on our revised approach to things. This was the funding. Last summer really was a go, no-go moment for high-speed rail in California. Had the legislature not decided to move forward we'd basically be on life support today. And so it was a critical decision, and Governor Brown deserves, I can't give him enough credit for getting behind it and really championing this program. And what we got done, again, was 4.7 of bond funds, but it leveraged all these different ways to produce $13 billion worth of investment in improved rail throughout California. Now in terms of what we are building, our first objective is to get to operation and build what we call the initial operating segment. And that's the point at which we're running full-blown revenue-producing high-speed rail services in California. And we're starting that construction in the Central Valley, running from, right now, Madera down to Fresno. The next section will be down from Fresno to Bakersfield, and then ultimately across the Tehachapis and into Los Angeles. Our target is to have that up and running in 2022. That becomes then a mechanism, because of the way high-speed rail works, where you can actually generate positive cash flow. It turns profits. Even the Acela line in New York, and Amtrak's line in the Northeast Corridor, on an operating basis, produces profits. It's subsidizing the rest of Amtrak's system. We will use it to invest in expansion of our program. So there will be a heavy private element of investment in our program as we go forward. You get a lot of questions, and there were many raised about why, we've got all the population centers, why aren't you just investing there? Why are you starting in the Central Valley? Well, we have a few answers to that. One is, as evidenced by what I just talked about, we are investing in the urban areas or the bookend areas at the same time. But there are a few reasons we need to start. One, there's no high-speed rail in the U.S. today. So for us to run high-speed rail service, for anyone to run it, will have to go through a very extensive testing and certification process with the federal government, where we have to be able to run the trains at speed and actually higher than the speeds we would anticipate running them. The only place we can do that, I'll let you in on a little secret about how you do high-speed rail. You basically need straight, flat track. And that's about it. And it's not much more complicated than that. And the highest speeds we'll have on our system will be down in the Central Valley. And so that's where we'll do the testing. So in essence, what we're building is our test track that will ultimately then become part of the revenue service. But it's also because right now there is transit, there is regional rail in Northern California and Southern California. There is not connecting it. And so what we're doing is creating the backbone, the connection between the two. I mentioned before that we have 3 of the 5 busiest Amtrak corridors. One of them is the San Joaquin service, which runs from here and Oakland down the valley and into Los Angeles. So you can, some of you may have done it, you can buy an Amtrak ticket from Sacramento to Los Angeles. Well, what you may or may not know is that you get off the train in Bakersfield and get on a bus and drive into Los Angeles. There is no rail connection between north and south. And so that one of the things, when I talk about connecting the state, that's what part of our system will, for the first time, provide that connection. Right now, the only rail connection north-south, well, there are 2 of them, actually. One on the coast, but to get from LA to San Francisco takes about 14 hours. So if you have a meeting, don't plan on making it. The other is the crossing over the Tehachapi Mountains, which was built in 1874. And it's the last time there was a crossing built over there. It was built by the Southern Pacific for freight traffic, and in order to gain elevation, it's very curvy and actually at one point loops back on itself in order to gain elevation. So it's not really conducive to going fast. We'll be creating that and as we come down the valley and get to Southern California. Talk a lot about the valley, and we're at the northern end of the San Joaquin here, certainly. But one of the things when we talk about connecting California, traditionally, I think people thought about the divide in California was north and south. It was L.A. versus San Francisco. Giants fans hate Dodger fans, all that sort of stuff. If the Angels were any good, A's fans would hate them. But increasingly, when you look at it, though, the real divide in California is the coast versus inland. Huge difference in what's happening in California between the coast and inland. Coastal areas are fundamentally flourishing, even during the recession. The Bay Area continued to do very well. LA overall, certainly relatively, did very well. Air quality in LA is improving. Air quality in the Bay Area is improving. What we see in the Central Valley is the opposite. We've got unemployment that is 50% higher than the state average, almost twice the national average. Air quality is getting worse. Incredible asthma rates and other things there. And so one of the advantages of this program is going to be to help with air quality in the Central Valley by making investments, giving people transportation options. We will be doing a lot of investing in clean technologies and other things. For instance, we are requiring our contractor on the project to use all Tier 4, the very highest level EPA certified equipment. So the cleanest equipment in the world will be introduced into the Central Valley as we begin construction on our project. And we are underway. I signed our first contract in August, and the design work, it's a design-build contract, almost $1 billion for the first contract. They're doing the design work and all the other preparatory things, getting ready to start physical construction in the next few months. And we'll be completed with that first section, about 130 miles all told, in 2018. This is our first piece that we're going from Madera here down to Fresno. We're working on the environmental clearance for up north. We've got a section we call the Y there, which is where the trains will head north, ultimately to Sacramento, and then west to San Francisco. We have the record of decision for this first piece, which is how we're able to move forward on construction. That first piece is the one that's underway. It's about a 30-mile section, just under $1 billion, $985 million. Joint venture worked out very nicely in that 2 of the 3 companies involved in the joint venture as the primes are actually California-based. Which was a nice add. But we were very pleased. We had 5 world-class teams bidding on our project. And that's indicative of the scale and the cachet of this program. We had members of team. 2 of the 5 teams were led by Spanish firms. There were companies from Korea, Germany, France, all part of different teams. So, we really are attracting world-class talent to this program. It's something we're going to continue to do. Our first contract, we worked hard to do it, and we're very pleased that it came in well under budget. Our estimates were at about $1.5 billion for the first piece. It came in just under $1 billion. Good start, far better than the alternative. That's the process we went through, and so. They are underway, and as an example of what this program can mean, it's got all the long-term benefits of the transportation improvements, the development improvements, and all that. In the near term, jobs are an important element of what we're doing, and we've already started that. In a small way, it starts with the fact that the design builder has just opened up offices in Fresno, in downtown Fresno, really becoming an anchor for the revitalization, bringing in about 250 people from around the state and elsewhere around the country who are now living in Fresno, many with their families. They're shopping at the stores, they're eating in the restaurants, doing all the things that come with economic investment. It's really the initial down payment on what California will start to see, the economic benefits of moving forward with a major investment like this. Our next piece will then be to continue south from Fresno down to Bakersfield. And we're expecting the environmental approvals this coming spring and to be under contract with our next big contract, which will be about twice the size of the current one by about this time next year. So by this time next year, we'll have close to $3 billion worth of work underway. And that's what this is, construction package 2-3. We call it that because initially we had planned on doing it in sequences. We sat down with the bidders, potential bidders. We looked at things, and everyone came to the conclusion that if we combine them, there were real economies that could be gained, real efficiencies. And so we combined them into one package. That'll be about a 60-mile segment. So again, by this time next year, we'll have about 90 miles worth of infrastructure. I talked about our commitment to being net zero emissions, but we have a very strong commitment to sustainability, both through the implementation of the program, but also through the delivery of it. We're going to be using 100% renewables as we go forward. Folks here are interested in hydrogen, so I don't know if we'll be able to get some hydrogen to maybe help us with it. But all right, there you go. Again, we're going to be net zero, requiring recycling. None of our construction materials will go into landfills. All of it has to be recycled. Again, a very aggressive program. About tree planting, and an important reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which the state, again, has a huge commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The whole cap and trade program is geared toward that. It's one of the reasons that we expect to be receiving funding out of the cap and trade program to help expand the high-speed rail program. Just a few last things. Again, we talk about all the benefits. One of the other benefits is we're going to be putting out literally billions of dollars worth of contracts here, and we want to make sure that we spread that benefit around as much as possible and help California businesses in particular receive the benefit of that work, but also be then equipped to perform that type of work in the future and the training. So we have a very aggressive goal of 30% of all of our contracts value will go to small businesses. That's a very aggressive goal. Most agencies varies 10 to 20%. So we're very proud of that commitment, and we've met that on our first big contract. So we're very pleased with that. And then job creation. Jobs are going to come in two ways here. I mean, in the near term, we look at the impact of the actual construction going on. There are different metrics that are used generally about for every $1 billion of investment, you produce so many jobs. And we haven't tried to develop our own metric. We use other people's. The federal government has a general measure of about 20,000 jobs created for every $1 billion of investment. That comes from men and women wearing orange T-shirts and hard hats doing the work, but it's then all of the support functions around them. It's all of the people working in the plants to manufacture, to produce the concrete and manufacture the forms. It's the steel. And then it's the restaurants that are now open or able to stay open or expand because you've got people earning money and spending money as opposed to being unemployed. So huge benefit. And again, starting in the Central Valley in an area that is sorely in need of job creation. But long term, we also will see an impact on the state. And again, we've seen this in we see it in the Northeast. We see it in other countries. A phenomenon called agglomeration, which is just the benefit of connecting up economies and the efficiencies that come with that. And there have been projections made that our program, as it gets implemented, will by itself, just by connecting up the economies, produce something on the order of a 3 to 5% bump in the state's GDP. And when you talk about a $2 trillion state economy, that's a big bump. And that's what we'll see as job markets become closer together, as information can be moved more quickly along. We believe we will add something on the order of 500,000 new permanent jobs just through that connectivity of the state as we go forward. So that's a big picture view of where we are with the program. Our next steps, I said we continue working on what we're doing now. We're going to be moving forward with this contract, starting the next one. The real challenge and one of the exciting elements will be closing that gap through the Tehachapi's. That is, for those of you who are on the engineering side, you can probably appreciate what it will be to get through there, those mountains, and the fact that we're not going to be going over, we'll be going through for the most part. So we'll be building some very long tunnels, a lot of viaducts, things with, and through very active seismic zones. So it's just kind of life in California in some ways, but it's a real challenge, but it's going to be a very exciting thing. And that connection, again, will just really bring some major transformation to the state in terms of mobility and being able to get between Northern and Southern California. And very importantly, we are working on how to solve the puzzle of how to pay for it all and how to piece together the funding that we're going to need beyond the initial proposition funding that we have in order to complete the system. That's where we are, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Yes?
You said you're looking for funding to do the rest of the project. Is there any strategy to keep the public support when you have, I'm curious because you'll have like this stranded connection between
Very good question, and we spend a lot of time on that, and it's a really critical element. Part of the strategy is what was represented in the statewide rail program and investing in the urban areas at the same time. We also, one of the challenges with this program is it is a long-term venture. And we're in a society of instant gratification, instant turnaround on things. It's very hard to get legislators to vote for something that they may not see happen, within their term. So one of the other things we're looking at is how we make sure that we show early benefits so that people see progress, see things happen. That'll happen through the job creation, for one thing. We're going to do everything we can to tout that as we go forward. We also have every segment that we build will have independent utility in one way or another, so that if we ever end up in a situation where we're stalled, don't have the next set of funding, or don't have environmental approvals, whatever the case may be, we can put that infrastructure to use. So, for example, with the first piece we're building, if we were delayed, we can convert that and allow Amtrak to run over it. The current San Joaquin service runs on freight tracks. If you've ever taken it, it's lousy service. It still is the 5th busiest in the country, but you only go about 50 miles an hour for most of it. By running over our track, dedicated track, built to a higher standard, they could get up to 125 miles an hour. So everything is being built with the idea of independent utility, the ability to put it to use. We're also looking at ways to bring private investment in sooner, deliver different pieces of the project sooner. But it is a big challenge of how to do that. Because again, this is a program that will be around for a long time, is going to require a sustained effort. Japan was the first high-speed rail system in 1965. They're still building. They just opened up a new leg last year and are building more now. Dan, you may have been on some of it lately. So I mean, this is a long-term commitment to something. So it's a big challenge to maintain the focus. Um, yes, the question was basically, is there support out there to provide the funding, both at the federal and the state level? And I think it's a good question when you look at what's happening back in Washington right now. Good news is we're not counting on getting any new federal money or any new money for construction until 2015. Basically, we've got all the money we've got right now is all we can spend in terms of construction. So we've got a little time to work on those plans. This is a case of, as is often the case, I think locals and states are going to drive the national agenda. We're seeing high-speed rail. We had a big bump when President Obama was elected and promoted high-speed rail, and that's where we got $3 billion for our system. In that, since then, there's been no new money coming out of Congress. But we have systems that are popping up and interest in Texas, in Florida, in the Midwest. People want to see this happen, and states are pushing for it. And so we're working with coalitions to try to create a national source of funding. Right now, there is no source of sustained funding for rail nationally, as there is on the highway and transit side. And so one of the things we're pushing for as part of a coalition is to create that sort of program for rail. It's a challenge, but I think that at some point the politics catch up with the realities and the needs for it. And so our key is to keep showing progress, show benefit, and we're also one thing that's different about us is we will be able to attract private sector funding. So the question was about you said it better than I could repeat it, but the growth being in the Central Valley and how the system will either, maybe I'll try to rephrase it, see if I got it right, but help support good growth or bad growth, and how that might, yeah. The growth is, the growth in the valley, and there are several reasons the Central Valley is growing as fast as it is. And first, it's just there are something like 7 million people, depending on where you draw the boundaries for the Central Valley. There are almost 7 million people in the Central Valley today, which is bigger than half the states in the country. And it's growing in part because of some of the demographics there, but also land is typically cheaper, but the flip of that is the economy is very undiversified, and that's big part of the reason we see the high unemployment rates that we do. And one of the things that high-speed rail will help bring is connect up with the economies of the more sophisticated, if you will, economies of the Bay Area and Los Angeles. One of the challenges we face is, hopefully you get a sense of, we have, again, we don't view this as just a transportation project. This is a transformational investment. But at the same time, our job as an agency is to build the project. We don't do development. We don't control zoning. We don't do things like that. So one of the things we're doing is working with communities. We're providing planning grants to cities, working with them to try to help make sure that as we make this investment, that it then has the desired effects in terms of creating the more sustainable development, helping diversify those economies, achieve broader outcomes. But it's going to require a lot of different pieces all coming together to do that. Um, Part of the reason I talk about the UC system as an example is, again, in a few ways. One, it truly has shaped California in many ways. I mean, California would not be what it is if it weren't for the UC system. And it was just as controversial to do it, when it was done at the time. And 50 years later, I think people would be shocked to think that it was ever a debate, to create it. Right, it can adapt. I think part of what we are looking to do with our program, over the last year or so, we've evolved our program significantly. I talked about how it was being planned and kind of in a vacuum, and there's some basics that are just there and have to be there about the technology and the system. We're also evolving it, looking at how we can deliver the benefits more efficiently as we go forward. So, for instance, on the peninsula, our original plans called for us to build dedicated infrastructure up and down the peninsula. That was very controversial, created a lot of animosity and a lot of lawsuits. It also was going to cost a lot of money, something on the order of $15 billion to get from San Francisco to San Jose. And the fact is, we weren't going to be running at 200 miles an hour anyway. No system anywhere in the world runs through the urban areas at that sort of speed. What we did was looked at that and said, we can achieve the same outcome by upgrading the existing commuter line, electrifying it, upgrading it. Instead of spending $15 billion, we can spend about $1 billion. That's a pretty good trade-off. And so we're looking at adaptability like that, certainly, as we go forward. How do we incrementally grow and improve the system? How do we connect with local transit systems? Ultimately, we need to look at how we make investments so that we're leveraging with local systems and not competing with them as well. So there are a lot of things as we go forward that we're going to have to do to adapt to the environment we're in.
But I'm also a little bit worried that so how are you going to control the cost?
Yeah. Question was boiled down to, I think, how do we control costs as we move forward with this? And with any mega project, I mean, and certainly a mega project, that's always a concern. And there are a number of things we're doing with that. Part of it starts with our procurement process. By going design build, that's a way of controlling costs in part because it puts the burden on the contractor to finish the design and then build it. It's their design to do, as opposed to the way, certainly here in California and through Caltrans, a typical project is done on a design bid-build basis where the builder is handed a full set of designs which they had no part in and have to then build it, and it may not work in the end. We have multiple layers of review of everything that we're doing to control costs. It starts, though, also then with looking at how to just bring down the program costs before we even get to a contract, like that example of the peninsula. Why would we spend $15 billion when we can spend $1 billion? Same thing between Los Angeles and Anaheim. The estimates were it would cost about $6 billion to build a dedicated system between LA Union Station and Anaheim. What we would get in time savings over an improved just electric grid is about 6 minutes. You go through the calculation of, do you really want to spend $6 billion a minute or $1 billion a minute, for time saving? So we're doing a lot of value engineering of it. looking. We have a team who's set up specifically to look at how to drive down the cost of delivering it, and then we'll work with our contractors to control the cost and control the scope. I mean, a lot of what happens on mega projects when you see cost escalation, it's not really just pure escalation. It's that these big projects. I mean, the most notorious in many ways being the Big Dig in Boston. Well, the Big Dig as a project morphed into many different things by the time it was done. There were whole elements added to it. There's an iconic bridge in Boston now that is part of that project. That wasn't there at the beginning. And so when you talk about cost growth, you're often talking scope change and things like that. So certainly for us, we're going to try to control that scope and stay focused on what we're building. We are. The question was about right-of-way and ransom. We are in the process of acquiring the right-of-way. We cannot, by law, we can't acquire right-of-way until we have all the environmental clearances for any given section. And so the right-of-way we're acquiring right now is within that first 30-mile construction area, and we're well in the process of doing that. Part of the other reason for starting in the Central Valley is that's where we have to buy the bulk of our right-of-way. In the more urbanized areas, we'll be able to stay within public right-of-way in many cases. So, and this is a better time to be buying land than probably in a year or two, just given the economy coming back. So, we're going through it. It's always a challenge to buy land. There are processes and laws, and ultimately we can go to court to make sure that property owners are treated fairly, but that we're also not overpaying, and figuring out how to strike that balance. It's a complicated process, but it's also one that's pretty well understood. The biggest difference for us is just the scale of it. And then that's the thing that always comes home is the scale of what we're doing, because even our first section is 30 miles. Scott, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the biggest project Caltrans has done in the state in the last 20 years was about a 10-mile stretch. So just our first starting point is 3 times the size of the biggest project that's been done in the last question was about CEQA exemptions and how they might affect it. We are currently working under both CEQA and NEPA because we have federal funds, so we have to go through the NEPA process. We're also going through the CEQA process. CEQA process itself is not that big an issue for us because there's a lot of overlap between it and NEPA. And so in terms of the kind of protections and things, the challenge with CEQA, frankly, becomes challenges to it, the legal remedies. And that is a lot of what we're dealing with have been CEQA lawsuits. And CEQA allows people to sue more easily and things. So you can have a single person holding up the project. One of the things that's happened over the last year is our project became federalized. An agency called the Surface Transportation Board at the federal level took jurisdiction over our program. The Attorney General here in the state believes that carries with it an exemption from CEQA. That matters before a court right now. We will find out sometime, probably in the next month or so, if we will be required to continue to go through the CEQA process. If we don't, it won't affect the environmental protections we're doing. What it would affect would be the legal challenges to the project. Two questions. One, will you be able to take a train, in fact, from end to end, a high-speed train? And then secondly, about demand modeling. The answer to the first question is yes. Part of our approach, we adopted something, and people have, it's been misconstrued in some respects, a blended approach to the system. And so some people have interpreted that, meaning you have to actually switch trains in order to get on. What we're doing is taking advantage of existing infrastructure where we can. So, for instance, as we electrify the Caltrain corridor, we would be able to run our trains up the valley and onto that system. You wouldn't have to switch trains, but it would save us the investment of a wholly new infrastructure. On an incremental basis, as we're building out the system, there would be points where, for instance, we build to Burbank, and to get into Los Angeles initially, you would have to switch to a local train to take the 15-minute ride into LA. As the system is built out, it would be a one-seat ride all the way. That is the way the system's being planned and will be built. Right. Yeah. The requirement under Prop 1A was that we be able to. The system has to be designed to achieve 2-hour, 40-minute express time between LA and San Francisco. Is a system that can do that. How any individual train ultimately will run will depend on the operator and scheduling and all that, but that's what the system will be capable of. Demand modeling, that is very much central to our entire business plan, and it was very controversial. The early estimates were dismissed by many people as being overly optimistic. Over the last year and a half, and one of the reasons I talk a lot about the last year and a half is because that's where I got involved. So I deny anything that happened before that, and take credit for anything that happened since. But we've gone through a very exhaustive process of looking at our demand modeling to make sure that we are being, if anything, conservative in our forecast. And some of that is to deal with the politics of things. From a credibility perspective, but also it's in terms of being credible with potential investors and other things. It doesn't do us any good to throw out numbers that just don't make sense. And so we've done a lot of things to modify our modeling. We have some of the best people in the world advising us on our demand forecasting. The General Government Accountability Office, the GAO, federal agency, did an exhaustive review of our demand modeling. And for them, they gave us what I consider kind of the equivalent of a bear hug from an auditor, which was they said our forecasts were reasonable. So we took that as a really positive thing. So, and we look, there are all sorts of studies that have been done about why forecasts have been wrong in other projects. And we look at all of those things and try to make sure we're not doing those. Forecasts like where they have assumed a big spike in gas prices that would drive people out of cars and onto trains. Very careful to make sure we're not including any assumptions like that. If they don't happen, then it blows apart your whole model. So we're very comfortable with our model as it is and where it's going. It's continuing to evolve, but and it's come down from the early estimates. But it still shows very strong ridership. Will work. There was a lot in that question. I will, I'll just answer rather than try to rephrase it. You know, we have, on one element, we have memoranda of understanding with, I think it's 10 foreign governments who have high-speed rail systems where we can exchange information, learn from them, and it's been very helpful. And we have we use that a lot. We look at, again, lessons learned, well, what hasn't. It's also a way to get technology sharing and also businesses. Interestingly enough, most other countries, particularly who have the most developed high-speed rail systems, are also very strongly supportive of their homegrown companies who are involved in this. And so, Scott, I think it was just yesterday. In fact, just yesterday, we had in delegations from Korea, Japan, and Spain, all looking to participate in the program in one way or another. Both offering advice, but also looking to participate. So we're looking to gain information anywhere we can, and we have mechanisms to do that. We're working with Amtrak also. In fact, we are doing we've developed a set of common specifications for our rolling stock. So Amtrak buys its next equipment for the Acela, we can buy the same equipment. And that will be an important element of creating a more stable industry here in the U.S., actually being able to start manufacturing here in the U.S. In terms of, the federal regulation is a key element of this because there are a few things that are fundamentally different about high-speed rail than conventional rail. One of them is we don't share track, and so we will not have freight trains running on our track, or we're not running on their track. We don't have grade crossings. Federal regulations are all set up basically for crash survival, and so what we end up with are very heavy trains. Kind of the idea being that if there is a crash, you're in a tank, and you're protected. The European and Asian models for high-speed rail certainly are in the opposite direction. It's all about avoiding an accident, and the trains are much more lightweight. So we've been working with the FRA to move in that direction, and in fact, that's what we will have a different set of regulations dealing with high-speed rail that look a lot more like the European and demand modeling, in terms of pricing, interesting thing about Acela, if you've been back on the East Coast and have ridden, it's pretty amazing what they can charge to ride on the train. Virtually every train is sold out, and it's pretty darn expensive. And it gives you a sense of the demand, and what people will pay for. And a key is part of what you're paying for with rail travel, particularly with high speed, and the value of time, because we can say a plane trip between San Francisco and LA takes an hour and 20 minutes, but when you add in the time on the front end, you have to be there at least an hour early, you have to get to the airport, you have to go through security. On the other end, you're landing at an airport that may be 45 minutes away from where your destination is. All that, that hour-long trip turns into a 4 or 5 hour long trip. And then you throw delays on top of it, because LA, San Francisco, for instance, I think it's 1 out of every 4 flights is delayed by up to an hour over the course of a year. Rail, almost nothing that gets in the way of rail running on time, on schedule. And that's built into many of the systems. In Spain, for instance, you get a refund if you're 5 minutes late. Very, very reliable. And for our pricing, we have assumed, this is a basic component to give you a sense. We're not looking to charge, it's not all high-end service. We're looking to be about 80% of the low airfare between LA and San Francisco. That's the way our model's set up. So it's meant to be affordable, but it's not but at the same time, it's not low-cost commuter travel. Okay, the question was about ag impacts, and will they in fact be larger than what we're saying because of the practical realities of how the system is built, and the fact that we will be going through farms, and so splitting them into parts, and that create operational issues for them that make the practical effects larger. That's an area we've worked very hard with agricultural interests to address, and for instance, we had a lawsuit by the Merced and Madera Farm Bureaus that was all about that and the uncertainty of that. And we settled that by sitting down and working through those issues with them. There are a number of different ways we can do that. One is just by picking the alignment and realizing that as a general matter, the worst thing you can do is go through somebody's farm on a diagonal. If you can go through on a line up and down the vertical axis, that's much better. Coming up with standards for crossing so that they can move their equipment from one side to another, and having some uniform standards and opportunities for them to do that. We're doing some things in our right-of-way process where, for instance, if we cut off a corner of someone's property and it's now not usable to them, or they don't, we can buy that and then resell it to somebody else so that they're not stuck with a remnant parcel. So we're doing a lot of different things to work with the agricultural community to make sure that the system is as compatible as it can be with it. I think we can address most of those problems. And again, if you look around the world at where high-speed rail has been built, agricultural lands in Italy and France and Japan and others, those issues have been worked through. And something we will work through. There will be impacts. There's no way around it. But same when 99 was built, there are impacts. One of the things to keep in mind when we talk about the long term and why we need to do this, given the population growth and all the other factors. Another thing to say is, what's the alternative? And if we don't build this system, what are we going to do? And we did some research to show that provide the same sort of capacity in transportation through roads or airports would cost at least twice as much, if not 3 times as much. And you're talking about adding 2 or 3 lanes to the 5 or to 99, adding gates at airports, things like that. So the cost and the impact of doing the alternatives in many cases would be far greater than what our system will be. I think the main thing is we're working very aggressively with the agricultural community to try to make sure we address those kind of issues and that we can incorporate as many things into our design as we go forward as possible so that we anticipate and deal with problems rather than deal with them after the fact. Eminent domain is a tool that governments have, which says that we can acquire property, whether you want to or not. It's the end. It's kind of the last resort. It's the end of the process. The preferred way of doing it, in the way that, and it's typical on most things. The majority of cases will reach an agreement with the property owners. What eminent domain means is that it's in the public interest ultimately to be able to acquire it, and we can acquire it if we have to. That way, we expect a small percentage of the properties we have to take will go through the eminent domain less than a quarter, ideally, go that way. We'd much rather work it out and reach. And I think what we're seeing so far in the Valley is the early results are looking pretty good in terms of our appraisals coming in at what people think makes sense, and so we're working through. If nothing else, those things, can be very controversial. We had an example in Fresno of one of the properties that we were taking as a little hamburger stand that. Funny thing was there was this kind of public outcry about this, and people demanding that we find a way to keep this guy in business. The owner kept saying, "I don't want to stay in business. I want to go. Give me the money. Let me get out. I want to retire." And people were demanding that he stay in business. So things like that happen when you take property, and it can be, I don't in any way want to minimize it. I mean, you're taking someone's property, so it's, even if they agree, to a price, I mean, it can still be a controversial and emotional issue. So it's not something we take lightly. Yeah, it's an interesting point. We, like I said, our it can take long. It'll take longer. It can be controversial. So it's not. Said that at some point, we're not going to hesitate to use it if we have to, because it's required to do it. So, but a lot of it is. We've hired firms to work with property owners who are based locally, who understand the local economy, understand home values there, and things like that, so that we're trying to be able to present people with offers that are fair and that they can take, and most of the way. Yeah. The question is, why start in the Valley, not in the Central? Well, a few things. One, we are starting in the urban areas with different kinds of investments, and with the electrification, for instance, on the peninsula. That is what our system will be, and that's starting now as well. One of the biggest reasons for starting in the Valley is that, again, we have to. We can't run high-speed rail until we get through the regulatory process of certifying equipment. That can take, it sounds crazy, but it can be like a 2-year process to get through all the testing and certification of equipment. And you have to be able to run at high speeds, and which we won't do in Los Angeles. We wouldn't be able to do in San Francisco. So in order to be able to put into place the whole system, we need to be able to get through that testing and certification, and on the straightest stretches, the longest, straightest stretches, which are going to be in the Central Valley. So that's one of the reasons we're doing it. But again, it's also, we're really starting kind of on all three ends, or on both ends and in the middle at the same time. And that's part of the message we're trying to get across better, is that it's not, while there's so much focus on the Central Valley piece, that's not the whole of what's happening. The operation of the system will be through a concession agreement, ultimately. It will not be a government-run system. It will be run by a private operator. What we don't know yet, because we're working through it, is what will all be packaged in that. So, for instance, we could have an arrangement where a consortium provides provides the trains, runs the trains, does the maintenance of the system, all those things packaged together. We might have a separate contract that is just an operations contract. So there are different ways to go about it. It's been done differently in different places. We'll be looking to try to get the best deal, basically, we can. But it will be, the basic model is it will be a private concession where someone would come in and operate and be given, say, a 30-year term to operate the system. They take the revenues, but what they do is pay us up front for what those revenues will be. And so, for instance, we use that money to invest in the system to expand it. So, for instance, on our first segment, we project that we'll be able to get at least $12 billion of private investment for the concession agreement that we can then use to finish building the system. In terms of the trains, we have not selected a vendor yet or technology. Well, the technology, generally speaking, it'll be electric, steel wheel system. But the vendor, we're just starting that process. We expect that we're going to have bids from the major manufacturers around the world, who are German, French, Japanese, Korean. They've all been in and are expressing interest in bidding on it. So, but it'll be the latest technology, right at the high end of what performance is today. I mean, our system is capable of running at 220 is what our spec is, and that's right at the top end of anything in the world. So it's going to be the latest, greatest stuff that's out there. Well, it's different in different places, and in some places it's a little hard to figure out where government ends and business, private sector starts. There are different models, and there have been different ways of doing it. But for us, we think that's the best model to go out. We will retain ownership over the system, and so whatever they'll be doing will be with us as the owner of the system. They'll be doing it under contract with us. But we think it makes a lot more sense to bring in the private sector initiative and creativity that can come and the financing that can come by having them fully engaged in it. But there are different ways of doing it, but that's a pretty common way. The way we're looking at it fundamentally is the way most of the systems are done. Yes. The net zero greenhouse gas, that is during construction, and what we'll see over the life of the project will be negative greenhouse gas emissions as we reduce VMT and take planes out. But during construction, over the course of construction, you'll see spikes in emissions. Early on, we won't be net zero over the course of the construction. We will. We're doing that through a number of different mechanisms. Very high-tech things, like I mentioned, planting trees is one way to do it, but also through technology and by requirements of the contract. We're going to be doing other things as part of our permitting requirements, for instance, with the San Joaquin. We will be helping them implement their clean air programs, doing things like mundane things, but can have very big impacts. The pumps on irrigation wells are tend to be diesel operated, so they put out a lot of emissions. They have a program to convert those to electric. We're going to be funding a lot of that program to do it as part of a lot of different ways we get to the net zero. And it gets to the cost issue because all of those things cost money. There's a certain amount, we have money budgeted for mitigation purposes. Any project has that. And we're going above and beyond legal and regulatory requirements in many ways because we think it's important to do that. But there is that balance, right? You don't have limitless resources, and there's a point at which, and we are talking public money, so we have an obligation to make sure appropriately. So there's a balance in that. And overall, as a percentage of our program, it's still a very small percentage of the budget.
I didn't understand that. But maybe, do you have a final thought for us, or sort of a takeaway?
Support it is the main thing. No, I do think, we find, and one of the biggest challenges with almost any project is getting your message out, and I think, and frankly, before a year ago or so roughly, I think the authority did a really bad job of getting the message out on a consistent basis, and it's something we're working on to try to improve all the time. But I think, what I would say is, again, one of the biggest challenges we'll have, and hopefully what a group like this, and particularly students, can keep in mind is the longer-term benefit. We're not doing this for today. This is an investment for the future, and you have to look at it that way. And we are incredibly fortunate, I think, as a state, and certainly for our program, to have Jerry Brown as governor, doing this, because I can tell you the easy political thing for him would have been to deep six this program because it's just big, controversial, it's expensive. But, he's looking out 30, 50, 100 years and saying we have to do this. And I think that's something that, people like groups like this who, take more time to look at an issue, understand a lot of the implications of it, can be very helpful. We're going to hit bumps as we go through. And that's a lot of what you see in the press, typically are the bumps, and you don't see positive. And so try to focus and help other people understand the long-term, the underlying need and the long-term benefits. That would be my ask. Okay.
All the operations. Based upon the current design
They would sell. Yeah, he's Catholic school.
No, I work for. Sacramento. I know. I have almost everything done. I was in the United States. Oh, yeah.
Now